The past often hides its strangest realities in silence. On the evening of May 10, 1941, the skies over Scotland echoed with the fading roar of a single Messerschmitt whose fuel was nearly gone, its engines choking against the dimming light. At the controls was not a young fighter ace of the Luftwaffe, but a 47-year-old man who only hours earlier had sat at the very heart of Hitler's inner circle. His name was Rudolf Hess, deputy leader of the Third Reich, and his destination was not to fight, but to deliver himself into the hands of Germany's greatest foe. From the earliest days of Hitler's rise, Hess had stood at his side, brawling in the failed beer hall putsch, enduring prison alongside his leader, and dutifully recording his words for Mein Kampf. For his loyalty, Hitler elevated him to deputy, granting him access few others possessed. But by 1941, Hess had been pushed aside, his influence consumed by ruthless men like Martin Bormann and Heinrich Himmler, while he turned toward astrology, odd medical ideas, and the occult. He became an object of mockery, a figure of little importance. Yet inside, a fire remained. He imagined himself capable of delivering what no soldier or politician had achieved: peace with Britain. In his belief, powerful figures in the British aristocracy were prepared to discard Churchill and form an alliance with Germany. Such an arrangement, he thought, would secure the Western Front, allowing Hitler to fully unleash war against the Soviet Union. For Hess, this was his path back to significance. Without orders or permission, he climbed into a Messerschmitt Bf-110 and flew toward Britain. He skimmed low over the North Sea, guiding himself by the last traces of daylight, his cockpit crammed with maps and documents outlining his proposals. Hours later, darkness fell. His fuel was spent, and he was forced to parachute into a field in Scotland, twisting his ankle as he landed. One of the Reich's highest officials was not greeted by noble allies, but by a startled farmer with a pitchfork. Limping and disheveled, Hess politely asked to be taken to the Duke of Hamilton, convinced the aristocrat would receive his peace plan. Instead, he was turned over to the local guard, who could scarcely believe that Hitler's deputy had fallen out of the sky into their custody. When news reached Hitler, his fury was uncontrollable. He feared Churchill would exploit Hess to damage Germany's alliances, so within hours, Hess was declared insane, stripped of power, and erased from official records. His rivals filled the void he left. But in Britain, he was not dismissed as a madman. He was studied, interrogated, and treated as someone who might reveal Hitler's designs. The question grew heavier. Was Hess merely delusional, or was he on a mission so secret even Hitler could not admit it? Branded insane at home, yet treated like a potential key to Nazi secrets abroad, Hess had crossed a line from which there was no return. That night in 1941 marked the beginning of one of the strangest interrogations of the modern age. To the farmers, he was just a weary German pilot mumbling about dukes and destiny. To British authorities, he was a puzzle of immense importance. Hess expected quiet talks and an aristocratic welcome. Instead, he was placed in custody, his swollen ankle worsening with each step. His first words were polite and insistent. He needed to see the Duke of Hamilton, who, he believed, would understand. But the Scotsman saw only an unusual enemy soldier. By dawn, his identity was confirmed: Rudolf Hess, deputy of Nazi Germany. Intelligence officers quickly descended, aware that this could shift the course of war. Why would such a powerful figure fly into enemy territory alone? Was it a ruse, or something beyond imagination? Under heavy guard, Hess was moved first to a barracks, then to the Tower of London, the same fortress that had once held figures like Anne Boleyn and Guy Fawkes. The symbolism was striking. One of Hitler's closest men now sat within British stone walls. Unlike the proud prisoners of centuries past, Hess was eager to explain himself. He spoke of peace, outlining plans that were both grand and absurd. In his vision, Germany would dominate Europe, while Britain would hold her empire overseas, together serving as guardians of the world. To Churchill's government, this was nonsense, detached from the harsh reality of bombed cities and a nation under siege. Yet they could not dismiss him outright. Perhaps he carried information about Hitler's next moves, perhaps about the looming campaign in the East. So began endless questioning by intelligence services. But Hess was unpredictable. At moments, he was clear, discussing strategy with calm conviction. Then suddenly, paranoia took over. He ranted about poisoned food, secret rays, and shadowy forces. He refused meals, scribbled notes blending politics and astrology, and slipped into strange obsessions. Doctors, psychiatrists, and even occult specialists were brought in. But no one could determine if he was feigning instability or if he had truly lost his mind. Meanwhile, the shockwaves spread across Europe. In Berlin, Hitler's rage burned hotter than ever. The betrayal threatened alliances. If Italy or Japan thought Germany was seeking peace with Britain, trust could collapse. Nazi propaganda swiftly painted Hess as insane, a once loyal follower destroyed by delusions. His name was erased, his office dismantled, his role replaced by Bormann, who seized the chance to rise further. Yet in Britain, doubts lingered. Some speculated that Hess's mission had been sanctioned in secret, that Hitler sought an indirect path to peace. Churchill himself doubted it. To him, Hess was dangerous only as propaganda, not as a negotiator. Their only meeting was brief and awkward, Hess rambling about visions of peace, Churchill dismissing him with a joke about lunacy. After that, Hess was treated more like a patient than a statesman. But he refused to vanish quietly. On June 16th, barely a month after his capture, he threw himself down a staircase in an attempt to end his life. Surviving the fall, he only deepened the mystery. Was it despair or an act meant to strengthen his claim of insanity? Whispers soon followed. Soviet intelligence argued Hess's journey was no accident, but part of a deeper scheme. Stalin, ever suspicious, feared Britain and Germany might conspire behind his back, leaving the Soviet Union isolated before the expected invasion. To Moscow, Hess was not a broken man, but a sign of treachery to come. This doubt corroded unity among the Allies, planting the paranoia that would later erupt into the Cold War. Many years afterward, new fragments of the story surfaced. In 2011, a claim attributed to Karl-Heinz Pinch, Hess's aide, hinted that Hitler had been aware of the mission. According to this version, the Führer received news of Hess's departure with measured calm, treating it as a gamble that could be disowned if it collapsed. Collapse it did. The official excuse of insanity fits seamlessly, giving Hitler plausible denial. Still, scholars remain split. Some portray Hess as a desperate dreamer, clinging to delusions of brokering peace. Others suspect something far more serious, that the mission was known and approved at the highest level, and that the fiction of madness was a useful cover to hide attempted negotiations with Britain. In the end, Hess faced trial at Nuremberg, was sentenced to life imprisonment, and disappeared into decades of confinement. For over 20 years he existed as the only inmate inside Spandau prison, a living ghost carrying the unanswered riddle of his flight. Whatever truth there was stayed locked within him. Was Hess nothing more than a misguided idealist, a scapegoat cast aside by Hitler, or the bearer of a mission too dangerous ever to be admitted? The only certainty is that when his parachute opened above those Scottish fields in May 1941, he abandoned not just Germany, but left behind a question that has never been settled. In that silence rests the deepest mystery of all. The sea at night was rarely merciful, yet in March 1941 its cruelty felt sharper. Somewhere in the freezing North Atlantic, one of Germany's most celebrated U-boat commanders would vanish. Gunther. Prien was no ordinary officer. In Berlin, he was paraded as a symbol of daring, the man who had humiliated the Royal Navy in its most secure anchorage. Back in October 1939, when war had barely begun, he guided U-47 through the treacherous channels of Scapa Flow, Britain's supposedly impenetrable stronghold. Currents twisted, block ships choked the entrances, and patrols kept watch. Even so, under cover of night, he slipped through unnoticed. His torpedoes struck HMS Royal Oak, tearing the battleship apart and sinking it in under 15 minutes. Over 800 sailors died, many trapped below decks. It was the first time in centuries Britain had lost a capital ship in home waters. By dawn, Brienne was gone, swallowed by mist, leaving only wreckage and grief. The event shook the world. To Hitler, it was priceless propaganda. To Britain, a humiliation so severe that Churchill himself feared for public morale. When Brienne returned, he was celebrated as a hero. Newspapers dubbed him the Bull of Scapa Flow, and his submarine bore a white bull painted proudly on its conning tower. He was decorated by Hitler with the Knight's Cross, and presented as proof that U-boats could sever Britain's lifeline. Over the next year and a half, Brienne lived up to the legend. On patrol after patrol, U-47 stalked the shipping lanes, sinking more than 30 Allied vessels and their precious cargoes. Within the cramped, foul-smelling interior of the submarine, his steady leadership inspired absolute trust. Crews constantly rotated within the U-boat service, yet those who had sailed under him insisted no commander was more capable of bringing men home alive. Bold and relentless, he seemed born to the hunt. For Britain, his name became a shadow cast over every convoy briefing. For Germany, he was a living icon, but legends seldom end gently. By early 1941, the struggle for the Atlantic was shifting. British escorts had sharpened their skills, their sonar had improved, and their tactics had grown more coordinated. The happy time when U-boats ravaged shipping nearly unchecked was ending. The hunters were becoming prey. On February 20th, 1941, Prien departed from Lorient on his 10th patrol as part of a wolf pack formation designed to strike at heavily protected convoys. For days they prowled an empty ocean, gray horizons merging endlessly with cold seas. Then in early March they found their target, Convoy OB-293, pushing westward south of Iceland. On the nights of March 6th and 7th, battle erupted. Torpedoes streaked. Explosions thundered, flares lit the stormy sky, and Allied sailors scrambled to protect their lifeline. Prien dealt a heavy blow, crippling a massive whale factory ship. Yet the escorts knew the bull was out there, and they wanted him destroyed. Two British destroyers, HMS Wolverine and HMS Verity, fixed on a sonar contact. For hours they pounded the depths with charges, each detonation shaking the sea like thunder. Sailors claimed to glimpse a submarine surfacing briefly before slipping. Below again. Just before dawn, a violent underwater explosion rumbled up through the waves. Oil spread across the surface and a reddish glow stained the water. To the destroyer crews it meant one thing: U-47 was finished. Word traveled quickly. In London there was relief, even celebration. In Berlin, silence. Days stretched into weeks, with no word. By May, even German propaganda could no longer hide the truth. The Bull of Scapa Flow was gone. But after the war, comparisons of Allied and German records revealed contradictions. The submarine hunted that night was not U-47 but UA, commanded by Hans Eckermann, whose logs confirmed hours of relentless attacks and near destruction, though he ultimately survived. The details reported by the British, the oil, the explosion, even the sighting, matched UA, not U-47. If so, what happened to Prien? If U-47 was not destroyed that night, why did it never return? Theories abound. Some claim he fell to other escorts that same night, their reports buried in the fog of battle. Others argue a sudden mechanical failure doomed the boat, perhaps a pressure hull leak, a battery fire, or a jammed diving plane. Still more haunting is the idea that U-47 was struck by its own faulty torpedo. In 1941, German torpedoes were notoriously unreliable. Some ran too deep, some failed to explode, and some even circled back. More than one U-boat had fallen victim to its own weapon. Could this have been U-47's fate, destroyed by its own hand? The truth rests somewhere in the ocean's depths. Despite decades of searching, the wreck has never been found. The Atlantic keeps its secrets, and the silence around Prien's fate remains unbroken. In Germany, his loss was disguised by propaganda. Leaders delayed the announcement, fearing damage to morale, and when it could no longer be hidden, they cloaked him in myth, praising him as a fallen hero. For the families of his men, there was only grief and unanswered questions. 80 years on, the story of U-47 endures not because of certainty, but because of mystery. The commander who once stormed the fortress of Scapa Flow vanished into the deep without trace. Was he lost to British fire, to cruel chance, or to his own weapon? The ocean has not said. His story drifts still, a ghost among the waves, reminding us that even the fiercest hunters can one day become prey. While U-boat shadows haunted the seas, another struggle was fought on a different front, not with torpedoes or guns, but with music. It was a war for spirits, for soldiers in trenches and patients in hospitals, for nations weighed down by total conflict. At the heart of that campaign stood a man with a trombone, Glenn Miller. By the early 1940s, Alton Glenn Miller was more than a band leader. He had become the sound of an era. His orchestra's distinctive clarinet-led arrangements created a tone unlike anything Americans had known, smooth, uplifting, yet full of drive. Songs such as In the Mood Moonlight Serenade and Chattanooga Choo Choo were not just hits. They became part of the pulse of American life, played endlessly on jukeboxes and radios, stitched into the rhythm of everyday existence. Radios carried his tunes into homes across the country, filling kitchens and living rooms with sound. For parents who had sent sons to war and for lovers waiting anxiously for letters, Miller's music became both comfort and escape. Between 1939 and 1942, he was the best-selling recording artist in the United States, enjoying enormous wealth and fame. Yet as the world was consumed by conflict, he made a choice that astonished everyone. At 38, he was well beyond draft age. He could have stayed behind, continuing to earn fortunes and bask in adoration without ever facing risk. Instead, he decided otherwise. "I can help the boys more with a trombone than with a gun," he explained, and he believed it. Miller offered his services to the Army Air Forces, and after persuasion, was commissioned as a captain. His duty was not combat, but morale, and he set about building what would become the greatest military band in history, the Army Air Forces Orchestra, a 50-piece powerhouse of swing and brass. The difference was remarkable. While other service bands were rigid and formal, his ensemble soared with vitality. They carried a piece of America first through bases at home, then across the Atlantic. By the summer of 1944, after the Normandy invasion, Miller and his musicians were in England, performing in hangars, hospitals, and even within reach of the front. Their broadcasts through the BBC and Armed Forces Network reached countless ears. For weary soldiers, his songs were more than diversion. They were proof that the life they longed to return to was still alive. As 1944 drew to its close and Paris stood free again, a grand Christmas concert was planned for the troops, and Miller was determined that his orchestra would be there. Now holding the rank of major, he was as vital to morale as many combat leaders were to battle. But just as he prepared to mark this triumph, tragedy intervened. December skies over northern Europe were brutal, thick with fog and ice, and pilots dreaded the words, "rime icing." On December 15th, his scheduled transport was grounded by weather, the flight canceled outright. By all logic, he should have waited. But Miller was relentless, driven, unwilling to disappoint the men he played for. He called in a favor, A friend, Lieutenant Colonel Norman Basel, secured him a seat on a small single-engine UC-64 Norseman. The arrangement was unofficial, but such shortcuts were routine in wartime. The pilot, Flight Officer John Morgan, was young but capable. At 1:55 p.m., the Norseman rose from RAF Twinwood Farm into a heavy gray sky. Nervous about flying, Miller joked before boarding, asking where the parachutes were. The plane lifted, droning into the mist, and vanished. At first, no one worried. Weather delays were common, but when the band reached Paris without their leader, concern turned to dread. Because the flight was off the record, no alert had been raised. Only on December 23rd did the Army Air Forces admit officially that Miller was missing, and on Christmas Eve the world learned the devastating news. The voice of American hope had been silenced. Investigators leaned toward the most straightforward cause: carburetor icing. The Norseman's engine was notoriously prone to freezing in the very conditions Miller flew into. Likely, fog and ice starved the plane of power, sending it down into the freezing channel. It was tragic, but plausible. Another life swallowed by the sea. Yet rumors would not die. In the 1980s, a British navigator, Fred Shaw, offered a different version. On the very day of Miller's disappearance, his Lancaster bomber unit had returned early from a mission. As was procedure, they dropped unused bombs into the channel before landing. From his position in the nose of the aircraft, Shaw swore he saw a small plane below them, its shape matching that of a Norseman, and watched in horror as bombs rained down upon it. The thought that Miller, who had lifted millions with his music, had been accidentally killed by his own allies was both haunting and sensational. Debate raged. Critics argued that visibility was far too poor that day for Shaw to be certain, and records suggested Miller's plane was not in the jettison zone. But Shaw never changed his story. Other whispers emerged too. Claims he had suffered a heart attack in Paris, or that he had been caught up in a secret mission gone wrong. None carried solid proof. The mystery endures. Was his plane brought down by ice, disappearing without a witness, or struck by bombs falling blindly through the fog? The channel has never yielded its answer. No wreckage has been found. No remains recovered. All that endures is the silence where his music once rang. Glenn Miller's final note is still out there somewhere, unresolved, echoing across the gray waters. Among the terrors haunting Allied leaders in those same years, none was greater than the prospect of Nazi Germany building an atomic bomb. Since 1938, when German scientists Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann first achieved nuclear fission, the idea had hung over the war like a storm cloud. If Hitler's regime, already producing rockets and jet planes, managed to harness the atom first, the results would be catastrophic. This fear fueled the Allies' race to develop their own weapon, the Manhattan Project. But while the American effort changed history, Germany's path toward nuclear power was marked by disorder and failure. At the center of the German attempt was physicist Werner Heisenberg, Nobel Prize winner and one of the most famous scientific minds of his age. Yet the Uranverein, the uranium club he directed, never became the formidable program the Allies imagined. Resources were scarce, rivalries deepened, and much of the group's focus went into creating a nuclear reactor rather than a bomb. By late 1944, they had not even achieved a self-sustaining chain reaction. As Allied armies advanced, the ALSO's mission seized their labs, their equipment, and even their notebooks. The conclusion was blunt. Germany had been nowhere near producing an atomic weapon. But the story refuses to rest there. In the collapsing twilight of the Reich, when dreams of miracle weapons filled the air, whispers spread that Germany had gone further than official history admits. Those whispers center on a valley in central Germany, Jonas-Thal. In late 1944, the SS forced thousands of slave laborers to hollow immense tunnels into the hills of Thuringia. The network was vast, its purpose never fully explained. Some thought it meant to serve as a command center, others as a final refuge for Hitler. But some researchers believe Jonasthal was linked to something more sinister, a nuclear test. The rumors point to the Ohrdruf training grounds nearby. On the night of March 4, 1945, as Germany neared collapse, locals claimed something extraordinary occurred. Farmers later told of a sudden flash that lit the valley like a false sun, its glow shifting from red to yellow to white, followed by a blast that rattled windows and left ears ringing. In the days after, villagers suffered nausea, headaches and nosebleeds, symptoms eerily like radiation sickness. One account was even darker. Hans Walton, a forced laborer, said he was ordered the next morning to load burned, hairless bodies onto trucks near the site, and overheard SS officers whispering that a new weapon had been tested, one meant to shock the world. For decades, these tales were dismissed as fantasy, explained away as wartime confusion. When Soviet archives began to open in the 1990s, the debate over Germany's wartime nuclear ambitions flared back to life with new urgency. Among the documents was a striking report, delivered straight to Stalin in March 1945, describing two immense blasts in Thuringia. The report claimed these explosions had radioactive effects so severe that prisoners of war caught at the center were annihilated instantly, their remains all but erased. That such a message reached Stalin's desk made clear how seriously the Soviets treated the possibility that Germany had succeeded in experimenting with atomic weapons. From fragments like this, a controversial narrative began to form. Historian Rainer Karlsch, in his book Hitler's Bomb, suggested that a faction of German physicists, including Werner Heisenberg and Kurt Diebner, had been involved in a secret SS-backed program separate from the formal uranium club. While Heisenberg pursued a cautious, theoretical approach, Diebner's group was rumored to have conducted dangerous, reckless trials. According to Karlsch, what they may have produced was not a true atomic bomb, but a crude hybrid device, in which a conventional explosive was used to trigger a limited nuclear chain reaction. He argued that soil from the area of Ohrdruf contained abnormal isotopes such as cesium-137, which he saw as possible evidence of a nuclear blast. The suggestion was intoxicating, that even as Germany crumbled in fire and ruin, some desperate splinter group might have managed to set off a prototype nuclear weapon. It was a notion that gripped the imagination, both horrifying and cinematic, and it has remained alive in historical speculation ever since. Yet most scientists and historians remained deeply skeptical. Their reasoning was straightforward. A genuine nuclear explosion requires sufficient quantities of fissile material, whether enriched uranium or plutonium, to achieve critical mass, and all evidence suggested Germany had never come close to manufacturing it. Allied intelligence teams had scoured German laboratories after the war and found nothing resembling a weapons stockpile. Even more telling were the farm hall transcripts, secret recordings of leading German nuclear scientists taken prisoner in 1945. When news of Hiroshima reached them, their reactions were of shock and disbelief. Heisenberg initially failed to grasp how the Allies had achieved it, fumbling his physics before reworking the equations days later to make sense of it. Their astonishment rang true. It would have been incomprehensible if Germany had already tested a weapon. Karlsch's claims about contaminated soil also collapsed under closer analysis. In 2006, the German Federal Office for Radiation Protection retested the ground at Ohrdruf and found nothing unusual. No radiation, no trace elements that would support the idea of a nuclear event. If not a nuclear test, then what did those witnesses see? Historians have pointed to other possibilities. Perhaps it was a massive fuel-air detonation, a type of weapon capable of creating a sudden flash, a towering plume, and devastating pressure waves. Perhaps it was simply the power of memory reshaped by later events, with villagers recalling wartime explosions through the filter of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, whose images soon dominated the world's collective imagination. Still, the story refuses to fade. Stalin's report was real, and the ruins at Jonas-Stal remain, winding through the hills, mute and unexplained. Was Hitler's so-called atomic weapon nothing but rumor, smoke, and exaggeration? Or did a desperate group of scientists succeed in unleashing something history has chosen to forget? The balance of evidence favors myth, yet in wartime myths carry weight of their own. This one lingers like dim embers under ash, whispering of a darker reality that might have been if chance had shifted even slightly. While Germany's nuclear ambitions remained clouded in doubt, another strange front of the war was playing out far to the north, one that pitted men not against soldiers or machines but against nature itself. In the frozen void of the Arctic Circle, the struggle was for weather. For German U-boats prowling the Atlantic, forecasts were often the difference between success and destruction. A storm could scatter Allied convoys into vulnerable pieces, but the same storm might drag submarines to the bottom. Whoever controlled accurate weather reports controlled the rhythm of naval warfare. By 1943, however, the Allies had grown more effective at intercepting and seizing German weather ships, severing a vital source of data. In response, the German Navy conceived a more daring plan: to build secret land-based weather stations deep in Arctic territory controlled by their enemies. Small groups of men would endure isolation in frozen wastelands, sending coded forecasts back to Germany. One of the most ambitious missions of this type was given a deceptively playful name: Operation Schatzgraber, or Treasure Hunter. But the treasure in question was not gold or jewels. It was information, the lifeblood of submarine warfare. In September 1943, a trawler converted for the mission slipped past Allied patrols and cut through the icy waters of Franz Josef Land. Their destination was Alexandra Land, a barren, uninhabited island at the far northern edge of Russia. 10 men disembarked: meteorologists, radio operators, and laborers, carrying crates of prefabricated huts, radios, fuel, weapons, and mines. Their orders were unambiguous: survive the winter, establish a functioning station, and keep the data flowing. It was one of the harshest, loneliest environments on Earth. Wind screamed across the gravel spit where they raised their huts. Sea ice locked the island in jagged teeth, and by November, the endless polar night had swallowed the camp in darkness. They planted mines around their perimeter, wary of both Soviet patrols and prowling polar bears. Supplies were dropped occasionally, by long-range aircraft when weather permitted. Inside their crude shelters, the men recorded data, transmitted forecasts, and ate canned rations by lantern light. Day after day, their monotonous routine continued. Yet the intelligence they provided mattered greatly, giving U-boat commanders critical guidance. Schatzgraber was one of the Reich's most valuable hidden outposts, and the Allies had no inkling of its existence. But isolation and monotony proved more dangerous than enemy forces. Life at the station was a bleak cycle of waking, measuring, transmitting, eating, and sleeping. Meals were repetitive and dismal: tins of meat, stale biscuits, bitter ersatz coffee. Fresh food became a distant dream, spoken of with longing. Sometimes polar bears drifted close to the camp, at first dangerous intruders. But over time, as hunger gnawed at the men, they began to appear as potential meals. In May 1944, with the sun now circling endlessly above and refusing to set, 2 crew members shot one of the giant animals. At last, fresh meat seemed within reach. The cook carved thick steaks, roasted them, and for the first time in months, the men ate something other than rations. Spirits soared as they laughed, chewed, and filled their stomachs. But their joy concealed a fatal error. The meat had not been cooked enough. Within days, illness struck. It began with the cook himself, writhing in fever and agony. Soon, one after another, nearly all who had eaten the bear collapsed in torment. Sweating, vomiting, muscles burning and inflamed, bodies twisted in pain. Only the medic remained upright. He had wisely avoided the fresh meat, sticking to canned rations. His grim diagnosis was trichinosis, caused by parasites in the polar bear flesh. Microscopic worms now burrowed through the men's muscles, eating them alive from within. A multi-million-mark mission, carefully concealed and supported, was collapsing because of a single ill-cooked meal. Reports ceased. In Norway, Naval Command grew alarmed at the silence. When at last a ragged distress call broke through the static, Berlin reacted quickly. They could not afford to lose the station. A long-range Condor aircraft was dispatched with a doctor and supplies. The plan was for the doctor to parachute into the camp, but when the pilot saw the dire situation on Alexandra land, he made a desperate choice. He landed the giant plane on the tundra, skidding across frozen ground and destroying the landing gear. The aircraft was stranded, and now both doctor and pilot were marooned alongside the stricken crew. For days, the island became a frozen infirmary. The doctor rationed what little medicine he had, tending to the suffering men. Outside, weakened crew members stumbled into the cold to hack a makeshift runway from the barren earth. Mechanics ripped apart the Condor's broken frame, working in freezing winds to piece together rough repairs. Finally, on July 11, 1944, the gamble was put to the test. The patched plane was loaded with the sick, bundled in blankets, barely able to stand. Engines thundered. The makeshift runway stretched ahead, little more than a scar on the tundra. The aircraft lurched, trembled, and at the last moment lifted into the Arctic sky. They left behind their huts, supplies, and the shattered outpost that had nearly consumed them, abandoning Schatzgraber to the ice forever. The frozen camp remained, as it was left, its huts, radios, scattered journals, and the minefield still circling it in silence. Operation Schatzgraber had come to an end, and for years the abandoned outpost lay concealed beneath snow and ice, dismissed as nothing more than a rumor. It was not until 2016 that Russian scientists uncovered its remains, finding live mines still buried in the ground and equipment locked in frozen time, proof that the strange story was real. This Arctic station, one of the Reich's most closely guarded weather posts, had not been eliminated by Allied bombs, Soviet raids, or the brutal polar night. It had been undone by something far smaller, a meal of undercooked polar bear meat that infected the crew with trichinosis. A single microscopic parasite had crippled an entire station and forced an evacuation. In that way, Germany's secret war for control of weather met one of its strangest defeats. When the final echoes of battle fade, what lingers is not silence but fragments. They exist in places history tries to bury, in puzzles that refuse to vanish, in tales that feel unfinished. The Second World War, immense and devastating, still leaves shadows where certainty collapses. Some enigmas border on the absurd. Others are chilling. Together, they prove that history, however carefully archived, is never complete. It is a weave of facts, whispers, and unanswered speculation that stretches across generations. One such riddle began in May 1941, when Rudolf Hess, Hitler's deputy and one of the most powerful men in Nazi Germany, entered a Messerschmitt fighter and flew alone across the North Sea. He aimed for Scotland. His intentions remain fiercely debated to this day. Was he seeking to negotiate peace with Britain, acting on his own illusions? Or did he serve a plan so secret even Hitler denied it? His aircraft went down, he parachuted to safety, and was immediately captured. Churchill's government treated him not as an emissary, but as a prisoner. For the rest of his long life, Hess insisted he had gone in search of peace, yet historians remain divided. Was he simply delusional, or was there a secret dialogue that Britain chose to hide? His lone journey hangs over 1941 like a question suspended in the air, its mystery surviving long after the man himself was gone. Mysteries, however, were not only carried by men, they were also etched in steel and fire. The French luxury liner Normandy, once the marvel of ocean travel and a symbol of elegance and engineering, lay seized in New York Harbor after France fell, renamed Lafayette by the U.S. and slated for conversion into a troop ship. In February 1942, as welders worked inside, flames erupted and spread through the vessel. Fireboats unleashed torrents of water, their weight capsizing the liner so her great funnels slanted grotesquely against the skyline. The official cause was negligence, but suspicion of sabotage spread instantly. The FBI investigated yet found nothing conclusive. Still, the sight of the once proud liner lying helpless beside Manhattan became an eerie symbol. How could such a great ship be lost without a single enemy shot? The uncertainty lingers like smoke above the harbor, leaving behind more unease than closure. The sea guarded darker riddles still. U-47, one of Germany's most famous submarines, commanded by Günther Prien, the same officer who had struck Scapa Flow in 1939 and sunk the battleship, Royal Oak, vanished in March 1941. To the German people, he had been a legend, a phantom hunter in the Atlantic. Then, without warning, silence. Allied accounts claimed U-47 had been destroyed by depth charges, yet German records never confirmed it, and no wreck has ever been discovered. Was it sunk by enemy action, or did it fall victim to mechanical failure, fire, or accident? For a submarine, silence means death, and U-47 disappeared beneath the sea, leaving behind only speculation. The mystery remains suspended in the ocean's depths, as if swallowed by the very element it once dominated. Not all losses were machines of war. Glenn Miller, the American bandleader whose music carried hope through dark years, boarded a small aircraft in England in December 1944, bound for France. His mission was to perform for the troops and lift morale in a world where music offered escape. The plane lifted into the bleak winter skies and vanished. Explanations multiplied. Bad weather, bombs mistakenly dropped by returning Allied aircraft, or more shadowy theories involving secret missions. Nothing was ever recovered. No wreckage. No remains. What lingers is absence. His music ending abruptly, his fate as spectral as the static-laden broadcasts where his swing once played. To many, Miller's disappearance became one of the war's strangest cultural losses. An unresolved, silence echoing louder with each passing year. Some echoes reach even deeper, into the shadowed experiments of collapsing regimes. In the forests of Thuringia, during the last months of the Reich, the SS oversaw vast tunnels carved by forced labor at Jonastal. Officially, their purpose was never disclosed. After the war, stories spread, claims of an atomic experiment. Witnesses spoke of blinding flashes, shockwaves rattling homes, and strange sicknesses. A Soviet intelligence file even mentioned explosions with radioactive traces. Did Nazi Germany, on the verge of defeat, attempt a crude nuclear test? The mainstream record says no, they lacked fuel, reactors, and the necessary expertise. Captured. Scientists themselves expressed shock at Hiroshima, their words preserved in transcripts. Yet the rumors persist, the valley's secrets feeding speculation that something sinister had been attempted. Whether myth or reality, the so-called phantom bomb remains one of the most disturbing mysteries of the conflict, a reminder that desperation can breed stories as enduring as facts. Then there is a story almost absurd in its tragic irony. Operation Schatzgraber, or Treasure Hunter, was the name given to a German weather station established on remote Alexandra land in the Arctic. Small crew endured relentless isolation, transmitting crucial meteorological data to support submarines and Luftwaffe operations. They survived on canned food and supplies dropped from the air, until the hunger for something fresh drove them to kill a polar bear in 1944. The meat carried a parasite, and within days the crew was incapacitated by trichinosis. The base collapsed, not under attack but due to a microscopic worm. Rescue planes risked the tundra to evacuate the men, abandoning the station and its mines. It lay forgotten until rediscovered decades later, proof of how fragile even the most ambitious operations could be. These accounts, Hess's strange flight, the burning of the Normandy, the vanishing of U-47, the disappearance of Glenn Miller, the rumors of Jonastal, and the downfall of Schatzgraber, are more than odd details. They offer a glimpse into the true fabric of war. They reveal a world not solely governed by strategy, but shaped by accident, folly, and cruel coincidence. They remind us that war is not a neat chain of causes and outcomes, but a vast chaos of unfinished stories and unanswered questions. Even the most documented conflict leaves gaps where the truth flickers but never settles into clarity. Perhaps this is why such mysteries hold us. They live in the space between fact and imagination. Official explanations feel hollow, while rumors feel too vivid to dismiss. In that tension, the past breathes again, refusing to remain silent. These stories show us governments making uneasy alliances, brilliant minds chasing illusions, ships vanishing without trace, music silenced by chance, and armies defeated by parasites. They also whisper something darker, that history is fragile. For every archive there are pages missing. For every memory preserved, another has been lost. For every battlefield unearthed, another lies hidden. What is known is immense, but what remains unknown may be greater still. The silence after war is not empty. It is filled with echoes, questions without answers, fragments of forgotten lives, mysteries that resist closure. To hear them is to recognize the limits of knowledge and the irony that shapes human destiny. They are not trivial curiosities but warnings, teaching us that ambition can collapse into absurdity and that power can be undone by chance. Even decades later, we are left to wonder how many more secrets remain buried in the silence of that vast and terrible